Now let's talk about EL expressions. So this part is your EL expression. It starts with the pound symbol or hash symbol, and within curly braces you specify the EL expression. There are actually two notations for representing an EL. So instead of dot you can use the bracket notation like this. You can put this in bracket and the property you can put in quotes. So you can use the bracket notation or you can use the dot notation. The dot notation is much simpler, but sometimes we do require the bracket notation. For example, in lists and maps, as we will see later on, the bracket notation will be required. Now, the EL expression doesn't have to be of two parts. We can have more parts than this. For example, in our animal bean, I have created a person object and I have instantiated over here itself. So, in our page, we can write something like this. Output text, and the value will be animal bean dot person dot and name. So it doesn't have to be just two parts. It can be much more than two parts. And this example, and here's the output. Until now, all our bean properties were singular objects. What happens if the object is a collection like this? So in this case, it's a list of strings. So in the post construct method, first of all, I populate this list. Just like our EJBs, even our JSF managed beans can have post construct and pre-destroy method. So we try to populate our list in this method. So now for accessing elements from this list, we have to use the bracket notation like this. H text value is equal to, so first of all we have to access the animal bean, then you have to access this element string list, and out of that let's say we want to display the second element, that is the first element. So this is the 0th element, first element and second element, so we will display blue this time. Okay, now let's save and run this application. So as I mentioned, bracket notation is required when you're taking values from a list or a map. Run, and here's the output, blue. Now that we have seen how to access elements from a list, let's now consider a map. So in our bean, we now have an attribute which is a map, and the map is populated in the post construct method, and here's the key for the map and here's the value. So let's access this value of y. In our page, let's use output text, and the value will be animal bean dot color list and y. So color list is the name of the attribute which is a map, and out of that we access using this key of y. So let's save and run this example. And here's the output. Now many times one bean needs to access another bean. For example, in our case, I created a new bean named my session bean. It's a session bean, that's why there is an instance of bean for each client. So each client will have a different instance of this bean. So I created a field called number, and it generates a random number. So basically each client will have a different instance of this bean and with different number. So this bean I have to use in this bean. So this is the way you do it using managed property. Now managed property is a very limited form of dependency injection. Instead of this, in the chapter on CDI, we'll see a much better form of dependency injection. So right now, this is how you should do the injection. Using managed property annotation with the value set to the EL expression pointing to this bean. So the name of the bean is my session bean. So M gets lowercase over here and the name of the bean. Let's now access this bean in a page via the request scope bean. Output text, and value will be animal bean dot my session bean dot number. Okay, and let's close this off. So I'm accessing from here to here to here. Okay, let's now run the application. And here's the output with a new random number generated. Now just to see if a different session is meant for a different client, let's open another browser. This is another client. So let's open the page, and as you can see, a different number is generated. So how many times you submit the value, you'll get the same number, because the session is same for this client, and for this client also the session is same. Basically, the scenario is like this. No matter how many requests come from the same client, always the same instance of the session is being accessed. We have injected this session bean in a request beans. So the request beans are created for per request, and the session gets injected on those beans because we have injected them using the managed property. Now we have studied request scope, session scope, and application scope. Now there are two other scopes, none scope and view scope. Let's first study the none scope. So let's create a new bean which is none scoped. JSF managed bean, and let's name it none bean. Okay, and let's change the scope to none. Finish. So what is the lifetime of none-scoped bean, or how long does the none-scoped bean survive? It survives as long as the referencing bean survive. For example, instead of my session bean, if I had used none bean over here, since this bean is going to survive for a request, then this bean will also survive for the request. Instead of this, if I have injected this bean over here in the session bean, it would have survived for this session. So lifetime of a none bean is basically the lifetime of the bean which references it. Now let's consider the last scope, which is view scope. So let's create a new bean and let's name it view bean and change the scope to view. Finish. So what is the lifetime of a view scoped bean? The view scoped bean survives as long as the user stays in the same view. What do you mean by view? View is basically a page. So as long as this user remains on the same page, the view scoped bean is alive. So as long as I submit or do anything and I still remain on this page, index.xhtml, the bean is alive. The minute I move on to a separate page, that scoped bean gets destroyed. To understand the working of view scope, I created a number field which gets some random number, and index.xhtml accesses the number field, and show.xhtml also accesses the number field over here and over here. Now index page has two command buttons. One button doesn't have any action attribute, so clicking on this button always brings us back to the same page, which is index page itself. And command button 2 has action attribute as show, which takes us to this page. Now let's run this application. And here is what we get. So this number, random number, is generated when we are on the index page, and when we move on to the same page, the number doesn't change because we are in the view, we are using a view scoped variable which is same for each view. The minute we go to a different page, the number changes because for this view a different view scoped bean is created. So let's see the bean scopes again. So the least amount of time period is for the none-scoped bean. It survives as long as the referencing bean survives. Then the request bean survives as long as the request is alive. The view scoped bean survives as long as the user is on the same view. And session scope bean is per session, and application scope bean has the largest lifetime, which starts from when the application is deployed to when the application gets undeployed. Now a bean can only inject beans which are in higher scope than this bean. So for example, request scope bean cannot inject beans which are in lower scope than this. A request scope bean can only inject beans in high scope like session bean. So here it's shown like this. So basically the left hand side I'm mentioning over here is the scopes over here, and the right hand side, this all scopes are the scopes you can use over here. Now the none-scoped bean can be injected in any type of beans without any restrictions. The request scope beans can inject beans of type none, request, view, session, and application. So basically all types of bean can be injected in a request bean. Here we had injected a session bean, or we can access a application scope bean, or none scoped bean, or view scoped bean. A view scoped bean can only access none, view, session, and application. It cannot access a request scope bean. For example, in our case, in our view scope bean, you cannot inject a request scoped bean. Now a session scoped bean can only inject none, session, and application scoped beans. It cannot inject beans of type request and view scope. An application scoped bean can only inject none and application scoped beans. Now let's understand the general format of a AL expression. So expression starts with hash and is delimited with the curly braces. The first part in the expression is known as the base and the other part is known as the property. So let's look at the general format. So the base can be either be implicit objects or can be objects in the scopes. So in our case, the base is animal bean, and always the base name is first matched with implicit objects. If the base name belongs to the implicit objects, then these objects are used. Otherwise, this list is queried. For example, animal bean is not an implicit object. Then we move on to this list. Since the animal bean is a request scope object, we get the object from this scope. Just to give an example of implicit object, let's use the param object. So in our application, let's write param dot name, or okay, it's fine. Let's save and run this application. Run. Now when you view the page, nothing is displayed. Now let's give a parameter. So over here, let me pass name is equal to something. Okay, and let's run the page. So basically something gets printed over here. This is because of the expression param dot name. The name of the parameter is name, which has been used over here, name. So up till now we have seen simple EL expressions like this when we access just a property of a bean. Now we can actually perform some arithmetic operations in our EL expression. So all these operations are valid. So let's see few of these operations. Let's say we want to display the total number multiplied by 100. So over here, let's use output text and value equal to animal bean dot total number into 100. Okay, let's save and run this example. So there is no action mentioned over here, so the same page is displayed and we'll get some output over here. So let's save and run. Let's enter some total number and then click this button, and here you get multiplied by 100. If I refresh the page once again, I get an initial value of 0. This is because of initially total number is 0 and that multiplied by 100 gives us 0. So what if we don't want any number? What if we don't want 0 to be printed at all? We want something to be printed only if it's greater than 0. For that, you can use the rendered attribute like this. Equal to an animal bean dot total number greater than 0. So what this means is this tag is rendered only when total number is greater than 0. The rendered attribute is there for all the HTML tags. You can use this in all the tags. And now if you see the page, there is no 0 displayed initially because only this tag is displayed only when total number is greater than 0. Anyways, do not go too overboard using operations in your AL expression. Use it mostly for linking to your code behind like this.